Hello there and welcome. Are you familiar with parts in NLP or internal family systems? And perhaps you're also familiar with CliftonStrengths. Then you might find our conversation really interesting today. My guest of honor is Lucas Forstmeyer in Germany, and he does beautiful work, very deep work with internal family systems. And he also has a strong interest and passion for looking at our strengths and what is already right with us. And we're going to explore these topics today. So, just to whet your appetite, in our previous conversations, Lucas and I went very deep. So, if deep feels like soul food for you, please stick around. Welcome, Lucas. So good to have you.
Hey, it's the first time I'm on your podcast, isn't it?
Yes. And I'm so
Yes.
excited.
Hey.
So, Lucas, internal family systems, parts work, just give us a little bit of background because there may be some of our listeners who are not quite familiar with it. I'd love to hear how you explain it.
Yeah. I'm gonna try to give a really short, concise introduction, and I want to talk a tiny bit about parts work in general, and I want to give a tiny taste for what IFS is, because in my experience, IFS is one of many approaches to parts work, but it does at the same time have certain uniquenesses to it. So just in general, parts work, as one might get from the name, is the approach of looking at us not as just one human being or one personality, which I think a lot of common psychotherapy and coaching approaches are based on. It's you are this one person, and as this one person, you may have different beliefs and you may have different perspectives, but overall, we look at you as being one person. And I, if I'm a coach or a therapist, try to work with you as that one person. The parts work perspective is fundamentally different. It's basically like, yeah, you're one person on one level, but actually on the psychological level, you're much more than one person. You have many what they would call subpersonalities, and different approaches have different names for that. Some approaches call them just voices or aspects, or I would even go as far as saying that many shamanic traditions call them like soul parts and
Yes.
all of that. And IFS just calls them parts. It's like, yeah, you have many parts. And that's the basic perspective that this parts psychology, parts psychotherapy, parts coaching, whatever, look through. And I want to just give you a few really simple drawings. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. There. Oh, that's the wrong button. This is very professional here. Um,
This
there
is
we
a
go.
conversation.
um, so, um, trying to, this is interesting. There we go. Trying to look at that. So, on one level, we could say we are all this person or human, and that's correct. At the same time, I think each one of us has had experiences where a really simple experience is food and the question of what should I eat? And you may have this one voice that's like, eat something healthy. And you have this other voice that says, chocolate is really awesome. And both of them can be more or less loud, which would then actually lead to what you eat. So if the chocolate is really awesome, voice is really loud today, we can also sometimes call it the devil on our shoulder. And the kind of eat something healthy angel is a little further away. We might eat some chocolate. Whereas in other days, they're both the same, and it's almost impossible to decide. I don't know if you've ever been in the supermarket wanting to buy something and you're like, I really don't know what to choose. One explanation in this part psychology could be that both of them are more or less equally active. Or if the healthy part is more active than the I want chocolate part, you wouldn't potentially choose the salad or bone broth or whatever your diet is. So that's kind of the perspective on parts. And many approaches to parts work have then um, looked at this and said, okay, so how can we work with these parts? How can we communicate with them, potentially help them to calm down? How can I, for instance, say, yeah, I want to eat chocolate 1 day a week. So you get your chocolate, but the other days I want to eat healthily. How can we do that? That's kind of the very simple understanding of just parts work. Does
That's
that make sense so
fantastic.
far?
Makes fantastic sense. And just a little question that popped up for me that maybe you can just clarify for us is this does not mean we have split personalities or we're unhealthy or we like on the, you know, that side of the spectrum where people talk about schizophrenia. It's not that at all. This is a
Mm,
normal normal, healthy human being.
mhm. No, it's not. The perspective in from if we look through this parts view would actually be to have many parts is super normal. Another really simple example for that is I like playing football. So if you're in the US, that's soccer. Um, I'm a very different person when I'm on the pitch, and I am very competitive. I have a very different level of aggression and of um, and yeah, wanting to score and wanting to do something than when I'm cuddling with my girlfriend. In one
Right.
way, I'm a different person. And the question would be, how do we explain that? And the parts perspective would be like, well, that's really simple. Different parts in you are active when you're on the football pitch than when you're laying on the couch in the evening. Different parts of your personality being active.
I love
And
it.
I personally don't look at that at all as unhealthy. It can get to a certain degree or to a large degree unhealthy if we truly have parts that are completely split from each other. And that would be one of the perspectives that, for instance, a multiple personality disorder would be, is that you do have, let me see if I can get back to, yeah, here we go. You do have multiple parts, and rather than them being kind of integrated in you, I just took a chunk of the cheek there, being integrated in you, it's like they are sharing uh, no consciousness at all. So it's like when I'm in this, I'm a completely different person than in this, and I have no connection between the two. And unfortunately, there are some people who do suffer that. They
Mm.
have two, three, sometimes even more kind of compartments of consciousness, but
Mm.
that's not what most people have. Most people have, or I would say all people have different parts, but we share consciousness between them.
Right. That's a great distinction. Thanks for that. Yes.
Yeah. So maybe going one small step further is the IFS perspective, and IFS stands for the internal family system, which I find a very poor name for the approach. It's called internal family system because the guy who developed it, his name is Richard Schwartz, um, comes from a background of family systems therapy. And he
Ah,
discovered, the same principles that I've been using in family systems apply to our inner family. And that's why he called the approach internal family system. I think calling it something like parts psychotherapy would have probably been more true. But most people think when they hear internal family system, they think, oh, my internal dad and my internal mom. And
right.
it's not really that. It's just the approach. We have many parts. But one of the fundamental distinctions of this IFS system is saying, yes, on one level of our being, of our personality, we all have many parts. But they also have this perspective that beyond having many parts, each one of us has one self. And the way IFS and Richard Schwartz has found this self, which again, different words for self could be soul, it could be essence, it could be spiritual core. Um, the way Richard Schwartz found out about that was in his therapy, he figured out, oh, people have really many parts. And one of the tools that works in family psychotherapy is if you have a very dominant person in the family system, like a father that is constantly interrupting other people in what they're feeling or what they're wanting to say, you can ask that person to step aside, to step to the back of the room, so that the other family members can actually talk. And because that's such a common tool in family therapy, Richard Schwartz did that to parts. He was like, this part is really loud. Can I ask that part to step aside? And to his surprise, and I think this is also a surprise to many psychotherapists, it's like parts will be like, okay. Not always, but many times they'll just be like, okay. So maybe one example would be in a session, there is a part that's really active that is very scared. Now, if that part is super alive in that moment, IFS would call that being blended. Being blended would mean it is blended with the self, with our awareness. And we feel scared. We feel potentially terrified.
Right.
And then in this understanding, Richard Schwartz asked, could that part step aside? And parts did. Now, what often happened was once one part stepped aside, another part came in. And it's like, now I'm not scared anymore. Now I'm fucking angry that I'm always scared. And he would get to know that part and he would like, can you step aside too? And it would again do that. And sometimes there were, what do I know, 3, 4, 5 parts. But once they had all stepped aside, there was something different showing up. And there was this calmness that people suddenly experienced, even people with severe trauma who may have never felt calm in their life. They suddenly felt calm.
Wow.
And they felt a sense of confidence. And when Richard Schwartz would then ask them, so which part is this right now? They would be like, this isn't really a part. This is just me. And through having experienced this again and again, he termed that me the self and said, so we all have many parts and they all want something different and they all have their own motivations, but we also have one self, like a core, a spiritual being. And basically that's the fundamental understanding of how we humans are built on a psychological level that IFS uses is we all have many parts. Parts are scared of things, parts are want certain things, all of that. But once they step aside, there is this self. And when we are connected to ourself, connected to that core of us, suddenly we have possibilities and options that we didn't have while all the parts were still blended with us. Because, I mean, if all of them are just active and telling us all these things are bad, it's very difficult for us to feel the spaciousness and the power that actually comes from being in this self. But once they step aside, something different can show up and show itself. So the basic understanding IFS uses is how can people get to this, where they are actually connected to their self, there's no part blended with that, and how can you as a person then from that self interact with your parts to actually help them and for them to realize, oh, there is something different that I can actually connect to. That's the very short, broken down version of what is IFS, what's the IFS understanding of our personality, and what does IFS try to do in sessions.
Beautiful. That is such a clear. I love the pictures. Of course, we've done this before where you draw things and it just helps us to just see it so clearly. So thanks for that. Makes it really easy to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So then, how about, I don't know if do you have some more to explain to us about the internal family systems, or shall we move on to?
Do you have any questions for it?
Maybe the one question that popped up for me was, so what do you say about integration? So sometimes there's this, I mean, I do some part works and some of the work I do, and we sort of try and help them to integrate in a way. We put them in our heart, or, I'm guessing there's so many different ways of working with them. So we can hear their voice, we can hear what they have to say to us. What are they scared of? There's always a deeper underlying need or something that doesn't get met. And if we can meet those needs. So what's your view on helping them to step aside so we can, but then integrating? So how does that work?
So I think that's a very good question. So let me try and answer that. So here's maybe one more subtle distinction. We had the point of we all have one self, we have many parts. One distinction that IFS would have on top of that is that in many ways of looking at parts, we would say the fear we feel is a part, or
Right.
the pain itself is a part. IFS would not say that. IFS would say it is a scared part.
Right.
So the part is feeling the fear. So one of the ways to look at that would be that a part, and if we take, for instance, this blue part, and I'll take a new sheet here, a part can be healthy. So for instance, let's say this is my creativity. It's a creative part that's really good at coming up with ideas, with creatively reacting to situations, something that in the CliftonStrengths we might call ideation.
Right.
A healthy ideation part, because it's very interesting that CliftonStrengths calls a talent or a strength a certain way of perceiving, feeling, acting in the world, because that's basically the same definition of a part. So a healthy part would actually just use that energy it has to do that, to come up with ideas, to react to things. But if a part gets burdened, which can happen through trauma, it can happen through programming, it can happen through all of these channels. It may be that this part has this sense of, oh God, I really need to protect the system. I need to protect me, or in this case, the system would be this person I'm a part of.
Right.
And suddenly it would, for instance, stop using its ideation power to creatively deal what's really here. And it's using its ideation power to imagine all the bad things that could happen to try and prepare for them. So all of this actually really positive energy that is there gets put into, oh, but what if bad things could happen? Let me see if I've thought of everything. Maybe there are even more possible bad things that could happen, because this part thinks it needs to protect us.
Right.
And then that would be a part, in IFS terminology, it would be an extreme part. We could also just call it a part running wild, because it thinks it needs to do something for our survival. In Gallup terms, we could call that an overused strength. It's actually the strength is trying to do things to survive.
Right.
And if I then get back to your integration would probably mean two things. Number one, it would mean, can we help that part to let go of that burden? And that can, for instance, mean for the part, because parts can literally be stuck in time. So this
Right.
part may have started doing that when I was 7 years old and there were really bad things happening around me. And this part never realized that I'm not 7 years old anymore. So sometimes for the part to just realize, you're grown up, is like, oh, so I don't have to do this anymore? No, actually you don't, because look, I'm living in a house and I know that back then you were scared that we would become homeless, but look, I even own this house. And the part said, oh, okay. And then it can kind of stop that. So that would be one form of integration, which means the part can actually get back to its natural energy. And
Right.
another form of integration could also be, so maybe this part again is burdened, but when it realizes oh, there is actually this weird self that is somehow much more powerful than I am, and it's able to help me. Maybe I don't have to constantly look out for danger, because there seems to be this bigger power, this adult, this, in one way, like spiritual adult, and I can connect to that.
Mm.
Wow. So that would be another way of looking at integration. So those are just two very simple ways to maybe think about what integration could be from an IFS perspective.
That is great. It's a huge understanding that I think can come in from that. And so, what in the first case, it does not mean the part disappears. It means it just can
No.
act from its healthy
Yes.
place. It still can fulfill a role for us. It can still do the healthy bits that it is there to do for us, but it's not like so integrated that now it's nowhere to be found.
No, it's actually, that's one of the, again, fundamental understandings of IFS, is that the parts are not bad.
Mm.
There are some parts that are extreme and they may act in ways that actually create problems in our life, but the part itself is not bad. And the part actually has a positive intention for us.
Yeah.
So even if this part is constantly looking out for danger, which would be incredibly tiring, and I can look at it constantly looking out for danger as, that's really stupid. And from one perspective, it is. But from another perspective, it's actually trying to help. And we can see that positive intent in what the part is trying to do.
Yes. Yes. It's so freeing to know that they're not trying to harm us. They're trying to do the best they can because it's a strategy at some point they learned.
Yeah,
It's
it's
the only way to help this person that who I am to be safe
yeah.
or
And I would say usually how parts do it, and this was connecting back to the CliftonStrengths, is by using the energy they actually have and doing more of it. That's
right.
usually how parts act.
Right. Under all circumstances, doesn't matter whether it's so I don't know. Let's maybe start going now into your view of so you understand CliftonStrengths, you
Mm-hmm.
understand IFS. So just start talking and let us into
Yeah.
the intersection.
So I'm going to have to draw another model, because that's one of the things I do.
Yay.
I'm good at building models. I think it's
Yes.
one of my biggest strengths is
Yes.
taking things and building models that are usually, hopefully, somehow easy.
It's very
Um,
helpful for us to see it. So please go ahead.
so we had this distinction that we're a being, or we're a human, because we can also be can be precise with language. There's a difference between a human and a person. So we're a human. Um, and as a human, we have a self that seems to be this spiritual core, and we have parts. That's the basic distinction. Um, now, I want to say a few things about the self, because I think one of the ways many people look at it is the self is always the same, and it's the same in everybody. That's at least the way many spiritual traditions talk about it, and I think that's true to a certain degree. Like, if we take this model, then kind of maybe the core of the self is the same in everybody.
Right.
But in my experience and my understanding, actually, this self has multiple qualities that it can take. And I think, so for instance, for me, being truly connected to our spiritual core can be incredibly quiet and calm. But it can also be incredibly alive. I think there can be a certain power in it, and there can be like a and a power that's standing up for things, that's going like, no, this is bullshit, no, this is true. And that can come from this spiritual core. And it can also be incredibly embracing, compassionate, and soft. And to me, all of those I would call just different qualities of the same self, but different essences that come through. And my personal understanding is that each one of us that is on this planet is being born kind of with a predisposition for different of these qualities. So if we look at both of us, I think it's once we talk for more than 1.5 minutes, it becomes very obvious that I think what our expression of this is, and our most natural expression of this is different.
Mm.
So the more I connect to myself and kind of the the natural spiritual essence that may come through me, I find out that that is in one way really unique, and it may be very different from you.
Mm.
And so that's one of the perspectives I want to have is, so each one of us um, may come with these different qualities.
Right.
Does that make sense so
M-
far?
Makes perfect sense. And I can feel into that with absolute clarity, like how different we are, even though there may be a dot of the same core, so much of it is different in each of our
Yeah.
um,
And for
unique.
instance, if I look at us, and let's just say maybe you have more access to this quietness, that doesn't mean I don't have access to the quietness. It just
Mm.
may mean that it's more natural for you to be in the quietness than it is
Yes.
for me. And it may be more natural for me to be in a certain kind of forward movement uh, than it is for you.
Yes. Yes.
And that
Perfect.
doesn't mean you can't move forward also from
Right.
yourself. It's just about the what's most natural for us.
Beautiful.
And I think we can just take that in one really simple step a tiny bit further, because my understanding of the strengths is that we are kind of, and I would even look at it as born with different predispositions towards talents, towards certain ways of feeling and thinking. And I really like Dries's perspective on that as um, we have different amounts of energy for certain ways of being, thinking, doing, feeling in the world.
Yes.
And one of the ways I start to think about that is kind of like the self is like a spring where life force, natural life force is coming through. And that spring does not flow the same way every day. And if we have maybe some days there are like leaves laying over it and all of that, but that spring is always there. And then if we imagine this spring is in the middle of a garden, we have certain like rows around that spring that, oh, that one was very pretty by me. Uh, Rows around that spring that make uh, that are kind of like proximity. How close is that to the spring? And then I may have certain parts that are really close to the spring. So these parts have a certain way of acting, feeling, behaving. You could also call them talents, I think, that are really
Right.
close to the spring. So for instance, if I have which I think is true for me, when I'm connected to my center, I think I have a high level of clarity. That seems to be one of the kind of natural essences that is easy for me to access. I have others that are way more difficult, like surrender is not my fundamental essence. but,
Right.
but clarity seems to be quite close to it. So many of the talents and the ways of interacting with the world that have to do with clarity, like strategic thinking,
Mm.
like to some degree intellection,
Mhm.
may be really close to the spring. That means, in the way I look at it, that my natural life force kind of easily fuels them. So acting in these ways actually gives me energy because it brings me closer to my life force. And that doesn't even mean I have to be aware of my life force. I have to be aware of who I really am, what my spiritual being is. I just noticed that, wow, if I'm doing these things, I feel good. Whereas I may have other parts and other talents that are really far away, like that are not as close to myself. So it means that if I'm doing that, so for instance, for me, that would be something like discipline, like continuously staying with things, which I think are in, again, if I look through this essence perspective, that would be essences that come close to will and
Right.
to a certain level of strength. I think there are different types of strength, like this power of will. And that one is just not very close to my essence. So for my life force to fuel these activities, it has to travel way further, which means it actually takes way more energy here to fuel this part.
Right.
So,
That,
yeah.
yeah, that's a fabulous way of explaining it and making it really visual and understandable. Love it.
So that's one of the ways I really think about this. And then maybe to just offer another one, because one of the fundamental things in the Clifton world would be we overuse certain talents and we may underuse certain talents.
Mm-hmm.
And that would actually just be really simple to explain. So I have certain parts that are close to my source, close to myself, but they can be burdened.
Right.
And that means they still get a lot of energy, but they may be overworking. And it can even be that a part is so burdened that the energy can hardly reach it
Right.
because it's completely overlaid. So that even though the life force could naturally flow there, it doesn't because there is so much burden on top of it. And that is then what we've talked about in past conversations, where it makes a lot of sense to learn. So where are my different talents? Which talents are really close to myself? Which talents are okay? And which talents are like, whoa, they are really far away. And then it also makes sense to look at, okay, so how can I practically use them? But it also makes even more, I think it's really important to understand which ones of them are burdened, which ones of them are like striving for survival, where maybe they don't even have to, but because of past experiences, they just keep on running like that. So that's kind of the
Yes.
very simple model I have to connect these two worlds.
Yeah, that makes beautiful sense. So again, it's sort of, people always have this, is it nature or nurture? Does strengths come from from your genes, or is it because you've had certain experiences? Well, both.
Mm-hmm.
We have a core. My core is pretty different from yours in the conversations we've had previously. Yet we have this awesome connection and we always have these fabulous conversations. So there's some overlap, something that connects between those two cores. And the things that are closer to my core are so very different from yours. But the ones, some of my core ones have been burdened with experiences in the past, but we came in already into this life with those cores having been set up in a slightly different way. That reminds me, and maybe you've got sort of something to say about this as well. In my energy healing, I started out way back 16 years ago with energy healing. And the person that taught us some energy healing, like if I've got a backache, right? I've got this backache. It's very hard to try and heal myself because, say, energy rays are, like letters of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E. I've got lots of ABC, but I lack M, N, and O, which is the ones that really need to heal my backache. And if I haven't got a lot of access to M and O, then it's going to be hard for me. I may make a bit of But that's why we need each other, because
Mhm.
somebody else has MNO, they need A, B, and C, and so we can do this interchange. So it kind of reminds me of that. It's
Yeah,
just
I
different flavors.
absolutely. So maybe two potential perspectives on that. Mhm. Um, so I think that energy perspective would makes a lot of sense to me. Like, this is me, but then I can also meet another person, and that person may genuinely also have a self, but a different main quality in it. Um, and there may be, again, certain parts and talents that are really like difficult for me, that for them are just like, yep, I can feel that really easy. Um, and I would say that then, for instance, in energy healing, also in session work, if I am trying to work with, for instance, my burdened, because it can also be my further away talents can be burdened. So my
Mhm.
weaknesses. So, for instance, whenever I had to do something about discipline, people always told me that I completely lack discipline, and I was shamed for that. And people tried to force me to develop more discipline, and all of that can just have kind of piled onto this.
Mhm.
And then, um, if I want to work on that, it can be incredibly helpful to be with somebody where discipline is just something that's easy.
Yes.
But if they have an understanding for also the struggles I've gone through, they can be like, yeah, this is easy for me. We can heal those past things. And yeah, maybe this will never become your strength, but we can look at all of those assumptions of you should be more like that. And this energy just flows easily in my system. And that can actually allow it to flow more easily in your system while you're with me.
Yes. I so love that you brought that up, Lucas. I call it borrowing somebody else's strength because there is a person in a group that I'm in who's got very high executing strengths, focus, discipline, achiever, and he's got the miraculous ability to break things down into small pieces and just stick to his plan, and he gets so much done. And when I'm in his presence, it's just like I borrow some of it miraculously. I feel like doing those things. I have energy to keep going, even though he's not right now in my presence. I have made this plan, and with his help, I feel motivated to keep at it. So, is that sort of the kind of thing?
I think that's a very real possibility. It's also, I think, where having a team, it sounds like you are then a team for this time where you, for
Mm,
instance, co-work with him, where certain, again, natural energies or natural essences can flow more easily because one in the team has them. One in the team has that
yes,
flow. So,
yes,
and I think this is why this perspective of the self is important to me, because I think it is way more than just, oh, this person has skills and tools and has learned to do this. I would say on this self layer, I look at it as it's a fundamental spiritual, even though I don't genuinely like the word spiritual, reality that this is an energy that flows easily in this system.
mm, absolutely. Yes, I so love that. It's a beautiful way to say it. It flows easily in that system. When I'm close to it, it's like a resonance and entrainment. We can sort of generally help our systems to flow a little bit better. It won't be our strength suddenly. Um, but being in the proximity of somebody, I know that when I walk into a room, people say they feel calm. Or when people come into my Zoom room, there's an instant feel of calm for them. And I don't actively try. I don't know what I do to make that happen, but there's this feeling around people, and we may, even though we don't know that we do that consciously, other people pick up on that somehow
And
of this self.
yeah, I really like that distinction, because That would be, again, one of the ways I try to connect these things of the IFS and the Clifton, is that parts do, and we need parts to do. That's what they do. Um, in one, from a very fundamental perspective, self does not do. Self is.
Ah, right. It's like the
But
being.
yeah, but at the same time, that being impacts the doing.
Mm.
So if people feel calm in your presence, it may genuinely be that you don't do jack shit for that,
Yeah.
because you don't have to. But but it is there.
Right.
And I think that's why this understanding also of talents as a natural energy, that I love that Dries puts it like that, because you don't have to do anything to get that natural energy. That natural energy is there. And you can then learn to put that into productive actions. For
Mm.
instance, if calmness is one of your natural energies, like a lot of listening skills will come very easy to you.
True. Then I can do something with it that
Yeah.
can be valuable. Mm.
And if you do a therapeutic training, you will learn certain questions, certain perspectives, but you won't have to struggle hard to be in calmness. Whereas for others, where calmness is not the natural energy, it may be more difficult to get to that space where asking the questions is coming from that calmness.
Yes. Yes. Makes total sense. So I have a question, and before I do that, I want to know whether there was anything else you wanted to share for us with your this intersection between parts and strengths.
No, I'm actually just very happy that because this is me. I have a lot of ideas, and it's very easy to create these ideas. But then I often don't do that much with them, because after I've had the idea, I'm like, oh, this is obvious. So
Ah,
so I'm
right.
just quite happy that I was able to share them. Um,
Yes, it's fabulous the way that you explain it. That it's really one of your talents, and I think it's a combination of a few talents that come together in order to give us this thing that we can do. So that's kind of something that I've seen as well. It's not necessarily one strength that does an action. It's a combination of parts
mhm.
or strengths, however we want to call them, that helps us to do certain actions really, really well. And this is definitely one of yours. So the question I had that came up for me is, in this model of the self, the core, and then there's certain parts of them, of parts of us that are closer to the core, so they get fed or they get energized or they gather their energy there very easily, and there's others that are more on the outskirts, and
Mhm.
there's a long line to get there, so they don't feel
Mhm.
so energized when we use them. In your understanding, do we need to try and energize those ones on the outskirts? Is it something that in your parts work, in your IFS work, have you seen that they do come closer, or because there may be different viewpoints, and I'd love to get your perspective.
So I do think I have no answer for that. No straightforward answer. Um, I do think that there is a very deep wisdom in figuring out how you're built and living in accordance with that. If it tires me to work with high discipline, I should not be in a job where I would need high discipline. Full stop.
Right.
I can unburden my discipline. I can I
Yes.
can uh, maybe reduce some of the psychological resistance I have to doing these things, but it will still take me a lot of energy to get from myself to the part.
Mm.
Because, and this is at least my experience, it's I don't even know if it's possible, maybe in really early childhood, but I have no idea, to like say, I know, I'll just put discipline in the things that are close to my energy source. I don't know a way that that works. I
Mm.
think there's something to be said to figuring out what gives me energy, what does not, and accepting that rather than trying to change that. Um,
Yes.
so that would be my fundamental answer. And at the same time, we will not be able to live a life where we have zero connection with the things on the outer uh, realms of our like energy. We will have to do certain things like taxes. It's just a
Right.
thing of repeating the same thing over and over again. And either you completely outsource that, or you just have to do it, full stop. And so there are certain things where you will need to use those parts, those energies. The question is, can you reduce the drag it has on you psychologically, even if it may not be something that energizes you uh, on that fundamental level?
Mm. That makes complete sense to me. That is kind of the understanding I've come to as well through experiencing my strengths, through seeing other people trying to use what we call in CliftonStrengths, the bottom 5 to 8 of your list of 34 are usually the ones that feel draining. They have a drag. They make us feel drained, not energized, not excited. Like I don't learn easily in that area. So what I'm hearing from you is we can unburden those further ones if they've got burdens like shame, being
Mm-hmm.
shamed for those things, being made wrong for being that way. Because I've had people who've been for their, you know, conversations, CliftonStrengths conversations, and then they get this light in their eye because of some of their other strengths, and their other strengths that says, I can make a plan, I can execute this plan, so therefore it should be possible for me to bring those lower strengths up to the level of the other strong ones because of their strong strength that says I can do
Mm-hmm.
this. So it's an interesting thing. It's like,
Yeah.
and then they go on, it's like, wait, this is not as easy as
Yeah.
some of the other
And
things. So
and I think this is, so this would again for me be this distinction between psychological burden and how close is it to our source, if that model bears any resemblance with reality. Because I think it can be a real drag if I constantly beat myself up for not having certain strengths. That can be draining as fuck. And I'm sorry, I hope it's okay to use strong language in your
I'm
podcast.
I'm a
Uh,
real person, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
um, but so beating myself up for that, or constantly trying really hard to get better at it, can be draining.
Yes.
And that would be the psychological strain. I'm not sure that we can probably improve certain things a little bit,
Mm.
but I think that's why this distinction between, it's not about how good you are at something, it's about, does it give you energy or not? Is it close to that core or not? Um, and I personally I haven't experienced a single person who has fundamentally shifted their, wow, this really gives me energy. I've experienced many people who have a way less strain with things because they don't make themselves wrong, they don't hit themselves with a whip for being not smart enough, whatever. But it's not like somebody who has always acted a certain way suddenly starts um, getting all of these talents and strengths that they didn't have before.
Yes.
That's not realistic, and I'm not even sure that that's like that we should strive towards that, because that would again mean you should be like everybody else. Where my basic question would be, why? Why do you have to be like everybody else? Like, look at what you naturally do, see how can you get better at that, see what gives you energy, and then go with that and accept the things that don't give you energy. Because so this for me is a major improvement, to just accept that discipline is not how I work. And just the fact, because my parents always told me I should have more discipline, doesn't mean I suddenly will. Just because um, and just because I don't have discipline in that like consistently staying with something way, doesn't mean I'm worthless. It just means I function differently.
Yes. Those are all such great points. How many of us were embarrassed, humiliated, shamed, all of those things made wrong for how different we are from our parents, because our parents can only come from this perspective that they had, from their strengths, from their core, from the things that are easy to them. And of course, they want to teach us to be functional, good human beings on planet Earth. So they can only teach us the things that come easily to them. And then I've had it so many times in sessions how parents are vastly different from their children and they try and make them like them. And that's where we gather some of these burdens, right? So so could you just maybe say a few words and then maybe we'll start wrapping up after that about how in internal family systems, um, this may be a deep
if
question for
if you
now,
now
but
ask me like how do we do that, that's a big question.
yes, yes. So perhaps I wonder if I can rephrase it and say, what have you seen happen when we do unburden a part or a strength? What becomes possible that wasn't possible? If you have a specific example or a general.
So number one, way less wasted energy on trying to fight ourselves. Because if we are not using a certain strength, we are constantly fighting how a system would naturally work, and that takes energy. We're suppressing a part of ourselves. Um, the second perspective, if we are constantly overusing a certain strength, unburdening that makes us use way less energy, because we don't have to constantly look for survival. And so that's just a very simple thing. And I think the more we can live from what genuinely how our system naturally functions, actually there is more joy and there is more ease in our life, because we're not trying to be somebody we're not, which is, in my opinion, pretty much a losing strategy, to try to be somebody you're not, because I mean, good luck with it, but I'm not sure you're going to succeed. Um, so I think that's the most important thing for me, is that element of ease, and just maybe and I imagine many of your listeners can relate to that, but somebody who's an introvert trying to be an extrovert, and the second they stop doing that, it it frees so much energy. And the same with, I think, every other talent. When if I'm trying to um, if I'm constantly trying to like resolve conflicts, when actually my normal way of dealing with it would just be to be like, I don't care. uh, it takes so much energy. If I'm in a job where I constantly have to work on an empathetic level, and I'm not meant to work on an empathetic level, it's draining. And it's just all of those things. I think that's the core. And I think the long-term effects of then actually better results and more joy in whatever we do, they're even just side effects, from my understanding of that ease.
Yeah. Lucas, I so feel into that ease and more peace that we can have. Well, peace is very important in my life, may not be in everybody's life, but that's closer to my core. So when I can accept these are my core type of energies, those are not, I don't have to try and be like that. I can stop doing that and just be who I really am and unburden the ones that are overworking or underworking, just unburden them and just tap more into that core and exude that energy. If everybody did that, yeah, feels like a joyful life to me.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucas. This was just a fabulous conversation. Do you want to just share your website?
There's probably a link underneath.
There will be a link underneath.
Yeah, if you're interested in this, my website until now shares a lot of my resources on IFS, and there will be more resources coming. Also, kind of integrating these newer models of strengths, but for now, if you're interested in IFS, I have a whole lot of free resources on my website. It's lucasforstmeyer.com. But because you probably don't know how to spell Forstmeyer, just look underneath this video.
We'll spell it out, yes. Thank you, Lucas, for your wisdom, for your clarity of thought. I think that's one of the things you talked about that you bring, and absolutely, the clarity of thought can explain so much to us when there's complex things to put together. So that was just really useful, valuable.
And
Can't wait
maybe
to
just
share
as a
this.
personal example there, because I think my clarity of thought is one that's really one of my clearest talents, and where certain parts of me are working incredibly well. And at the same time, I think it was burdened to some degree because school systems are not always very friendly towards people with very clear uh, uh, thoughts. But in addition to that, because it's always come so easy, I've almost felt ashamed for it. So it was too easy. Certain things that many people struggle with were always too easy for me. So I think for me to own this and to accept that this is the way I work and that this is something I can offer that's actually easy for me but useful for others is one of my bigger unburdenings that takes place in that very, very inner circle. And that actually allows me to have a lot more ease in whatever I do. So that's maybe just a very personal endpoint as to how that unburdening can work.
That is fabulous. I had goosebumps as you were saying that. And that is the power of unburdening them. And it happens sometimes gradually and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes quickly. And thank you so much for sharing that personal example. I think that's a fabulous point to end on. Thanks, Lucas. And thank you to
Thank
our
you very much
listeners.
for having me.
You're so welcome.
Well, then, you're going to hit that